You were never enough. That's what the note said. Tucked under my boutonniere, right where her lips should have been. I stood alone at the altar, in front of 2 ushers too ashamed to meet my eyes, and pews as empty as my voicemail. No guests, no vows. Just a text from Melissa. Start without me? But it wasn't just her. My best friend crossed the street to avoid me. Contractors I'd mentored whispered behind tool racks. Turns out, the whole town knew, and not one warned me. They let me walk into that church like a punchline. But what they didn't know is, I kept everything. Every receipt, every message, every lie. And next Tuesday, on the courthouse steps, I'm bringing a microphone. Let's see who shows up then. My name is Scott Weston, and I'm 45 years old. Every morning at 5, I unlock my father's hardware store, now mine since his passing 3 years ago, and prepare for another day of serving our small town. The regulars call this place reliable, like the morning coffee steam that curls above my ancient register, while sawdust and cedar scents drift through the aisles. My fiancée Melissa, whom I met last spring, keeps changing our wedding plans, insisting she alone handle the guest list. The bell over the door chimes its usual rhythm, but lately, something feels off. The way old friends dodge my eyes, how my brother-in-law Dan stopped dropping by. Still, I have what Dad taught me. Every receipt, every conversation, logged in leather-bound books behind the counter. But let me start from the beginning. I'd spent 2 months' profits on that charcoal suit. Had it tailored 3 times to sit just right across my shoulders. You know that feeling when everything's perfect on paper but your gut's screaming? That was me. Standing in the church vestibule at 1:45 p.m., watching the minute hand tick toward our 2 o'clock ceremony. The organist, Mrs. Henderson, who'd played at my parents' wedding 30 years ago, kept hitting the same 3 notes, like she was trying to warm up the empty sanctuary. Empty. Not a single guest had arrived yet. The wooden pews stretched out before me, row after row of polished oak bearing witness to absolutely nothing. 2 ushers, both kids I'd hired part-time at the store, kept glancing at each other, then at their phones, then at me. Tommy, the younger one, couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. He just kept straightening his boutonniere, over and over, like it was the most important task in the world. My phone buzzed. A text from Melissa. Running late. Start without me? I stared at those words until they blurred. Start what? There was no one here to start with. That's when I felt something crinkle against my chest. Tucked beneath my own boutonniere was a cream-colored envelope I hadn't noticed before. My hands shook as I opened it. Funny how your body knows the truth before your mind catches up. You were never enough. 4 words. Just 4 words to sum up what she thought of my whole life. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, that thick kind she'd insisted on for all the invitations. I wondered if she'd written this note on the same day she'd addressed those envelopes, planning this moment while smiling across our kitchen table. I needed air. The church doors felt heavier than usual as I pushed them open, stepping out into a breeze that carried the sharp smell of coming rain and wet asphalt. My father used to say you could smell trouble on the wind if you paid attention. Well, Dad, I sure smelled it now. Standing there on those concrete steps, everything clicked into place. The way my regular customers had stopped meeting my eyes last week. How Dan, my soon-to-be brother-in-law, had canceled our usual Thursday night beers. Even old Frank Donovan, who'd fought alongside my father in Vietnam, had seemed oddly distant when he'd stopped by the store yesterday. The church photographer, another local I'd known for years, lowered his camera. He'd been adjusting his tripod, probably planning where to arrange the wedding party. Now he just stood there, his lens pointed at nothing, while sympathy crawled across his face. Mr. Weston, he started. But I held up my hand. I couldn't bear whatever he was about to say. I walked back inside, my dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. The florist was arranging lilies near the altar. Melissa's choice, not mine. I'd wanted simple daisies, like the ones that grew wild behind the hardware store. Pack it up, I told her, quietly. Everything's canceled. She nodded too quickly, like she'd been expecting this. The choir director was already gathering hymnals, stacking them with careful hands that seemed desperate for something to do. Mrs. Henderson's organ had finally fallen silent. Standing there in that hollow space, watching everyone dismantle what should have been the happiest day of my life, a question rose up in my chest like a living thing. If everyone in town knew what was coming, and clearly they did, why hadn't a single one of them warned me? The note crinkled in my pocket as I clenched my fist. That expensive paper felt like it was burning through the fabric, branding those 4 words right into my skin. You were never enough. The rain finally started falling outside, drumming against the stained glass windows. Each drop felt like another person who'd chosen silence over truth, who'd let me walk right into this trap with my head held high and my heart wide open. The morning after my wedding that wasn't, I unlocked the store exactly at 6 like always. The bell above the door chimed its usual welcome, but something felt different. The silence outside pressed against the windows like a physical thing, making even that familiar ring sound hollow. You know those moments when everything looks the same but feels wrong? Like someone's moved all your furniture an inch to the left while you were sleeping? That's what my store felt like that morning. The aisles still smelled of cedar and metal, but the comfort was gone. Mrs. Peterson, who usually spent 20 minutes choosing just the right shade of paint while telling me about her grandkids, grabbed her supplies and practically ran to the register. She couldn't even look at me while I rang her up. Her hands shook when she handed over her credit card. "Everything okay, Mrs. P?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Fine, she mumbled, snatching her receipt and hurrying out like the place was on fire. By 10, I noticed Bob and Steve, contractors who'd been buying supplies from us since my father's time, huddled near the fasteners aisle. They were whispering, heads bent close together, but I caught fragments floating across the store. "Can't believe she actually... Whole town knew. Wonder if he suspected..." The moment they saw me coming, they scattered like spooked deer. Bob left his half-filled basket right there on the floor. Through the front window, I spotted Jimmy Carter. We'd played Little League together, shared our first beer behind the high school bleachers, crossing Main Street. He'd been heading straight for the store, but the moment he saw me through the glass, he veered away so fast, he nearly tripped over his own feet. I remembered the sound of his laugh at my bachelor party just 2 weeks ago. Now he couldn't even manage a wave. At closing time, I sat at the register, the same spot where I'd watched my father count out each day's take for 20 years before me. The drawer felt lighter than usual. I started adding receipts, my father's old discipline keeping my hands steady even while my stomach churned. 40%. Sales were down 40% in a single day. The numbers stared back at me like an accusation. I tapped the drawer shut, and it echoed like a hollow drum in the empty store. My tux jacket was still draped over the office chair where I'd tossed it this morning. The note crinkled in the pocket as I pulled it out again. "You were never enough." The words seemed to have grown sharper edges overnight, burrowing under my ribs with each reading. Opening my laptop, I started drafting emails to vendors. How do you tell people you've worked with for decades that you suddenly can't pay them? That their reliable customer might not be so reliable anymore? My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I searched for the right words. "Due to unexpected circumstances, delete. I regret to inform you. Delete. I've always prided myself on prompt payment. Delete." The cursor blinked at me like a judgmental eye. I had 5 drafts saved, none sent, when the clock struck 7. Time to close up. I walked to the front door, flipping the sign to closed. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on outside, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalk. My hand moved toward the light switch. One pull, and I could shut it all down. The store, the memories, every last echo of my father's voice telling me that a man's word was his bond. The bell chimed. "Scott?" A gravelly voice, like stones in a tumbler, cut through the dimness. Frank Donovan stood in the doorway, his worn cap in his hands. He looked older than I remembered from yesterday at the church. Or maybe it was just the way the shadows caught the lines around his eyes. That moment hung there between us like a held breath. Frank, who'd pulled my father out of fire in Vietnam, who'd taught me to throw a curveball, who'd been the first customer through our doors every Saturday morning for 30 years, stood as still as a photograph, waiting. I gestured toward the back office. "Come on in, Frank. Let me put on a fresh pot." The old coffee maker in the office had been there since before I took over. One of those industrial-grade machines that could survive a nuclear blast. Dad always said cheap coffee makers were like cheap friends. They'd let you down when you needed them most. Frank settled into the worn leather chair across from my desk while I measured out the grounds. Neither of us spoke until I handed him a steaming mug, black as night, just like he'd always taken it. "Your father," Frank said, nodding toward the framed photo on the wall. Dad stood proud in front of the store on opening day, sleeves rolled up. That half-smile of his saying more than words ever could. Jack would have seen this coming. He always said the quietest snake strikes hardest. My hand tightened around my own mug. "Seen what coming, Frank? The systematic dismantling of your reputation." Frank took a slow sip, his reporter's eyes never leaving my face. Melissa's family didn't just plan a wedding day humiliation, they engineered a social vacuum. Been watching it happen for weeks now. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. What are you talking about? First, they started with the subtle stuff. Your wedding invitations? Half of them never made it to mailboxes. I checked with Tom down at the post office. Whole batches got lost in processing. Frank's fingers sketched quotation marks in the air. Then came the whisper campaign. Little rumors, strategically placed. Questions about your business practices, hints about gambling debts, suggestions that maybe you weren't as reliable as everyone thought. Each word hit like a hammer blow. I remembered Sarah Peterson's shaking hands at the register, Bob and Steve's whispers, Jimmy crossing the street. They worked your social media too, Frank continued. Got people to unfollow your store's page, block your personal accounts. Created digital distance that felt natural. By the time the wedding day rolled around, they'd built a wall of doubt so thick nobody wanted to risk being associated with you. My stomach clenched. How do you know all this? 30 years as an investigative journalist teaches you to recognize patterns. This wasn't just malice, it was methodology, calculated character assassination. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered notepad. I've been keeping track. Dates, names, specific incidents. The kind of details that tell a story nobody can deny. He pushed the notepad across my desk. The pages were filled with his precise handwriting. Times, locations, overheard conversations. My eyes caught phrases like coordinated disinformation and targeted isolation strategy. Sometimes, Frank said, leaning forward, the loudest silence needs a microphone. Something clicked in my mind. The same instinct that had made me keep every receipt, log every transaction, document every repair, just like Dad taught me. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about truth. I pulled out my father's old ledger, the one he'd started the day he opened the store. The leather was worn smooth from decades of use. Opening to a fresh page, I wrote in clear letters. Truth, itemized. Tomorrow morning, I said, looking up at Frank. 7 a.m. Before the store opens, we'll start putting together everything we can prove. Frank nodded, finishing his coffee. I'll bring what I have. We'll build it piece by piece, just like your father built this place. After he left, I walked the aisles one last time before locking up. The smell of cedar from the lumber section wrapped around me like an old friend's embrace. Dad always said that smell meant honesty. Raw wood couldn't lie about what it was. Standing there in the quiet, I ran my fingers over Frank's notepad. What would we find when we started pulling threads? Which provable fact would be the first domino to fall? 7 a.m. sharp, and Frank's knock echoed through the empty store. I'd already made coffee. The good stuff this time, not the backpot brew we'd settled for yesterday. You know how some mornings just feel different? Like the air itself knows something's about to change? Got everything? Frank asked, setting his worn leather briefcase on the counter. I nodded, pulling out 3 months of bank statements, my transaction logs, and a fresh legal pad. Every penny I've tracked since the engagement. Good man. Frank's voice had that familiar growl of a reporter catching a scent. Your father taught you well about keeping records. For the next 2 hours, we spread papers across the counter like we were piecing together a jigsaw puzzle. Frank had brought printouts from the state's public business registry. Every filing, amendment, and capital injection from Melissa's brother's company over the past year. Look here, Frank said, tapping a withdrawal from my account. $5,000 on March 15th. I flipped through his registry pages. There it was, a capital contribution to her brother's business logged the very next day. Same amount, just 20 hours later. Could be coincidence, I said, but my gut knew better. Frank snorted. Once is coincidence. Let's see how many more match up. We worked methodically, highlighting each withdrawal from my accounts in yellow, then cross-referencing dates and amounts against the business registry. Every time we found a match within 24 hours, I marked it in orange and drew connecting arrows between the entries. $3,500 on April 2nd, I muttered, drawing another arrow. Deposited to his company April 3rd. $7,000 on May 1st, Frank added. Posted to his books May 2nd. The pattern emerged like rust bleeding through paint. Over 3 months, nearly $45,000 had flowed from my accounts into her brother's business. Each transfer carefully timed, each amount precisely matched. You ever have one of those moments where the truth hits you so hard it actually feels physical? My chest tightened as I realized just how long they'd been playing me. I grabbed a fresh legal pad and started drafting a timeline. Dad always said emotion clouds facts, so I kept the language clean and neutral. March 15. $5,000 withdrawn from account ending. 4724 March 16th. $5,000 capital contribution recorded for Sterling Ventures LLC. Line by line, date by date, I built the record. No accusations, no anger, just times, amounts, and documented transfers. The facts would speak for themselves. Frank watched me write, occasionally suggesting clearer wording or pointing out additional details we should include. When the timeline was complete, I typed it up, printed 3 copies, and added them to a new binder. Financial trail, I wrote on the tab, pressing hard enough that the Sharpie squeaked. Smart move, Frank nodded as I photographed each page with my phone. Your father always preached backups. The memory hit me like a warm breeze. Dad at his desk, methodically scanning every important document, telling me, son, paper burns, but digital lives forever. Keep copies where they can't touch them. Emailed the photos to both my accounts and saved them to the cloud. By the time we finished, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the store windows. First thing tomorrow, I said, sliding the binder into my briefcase. I'm taking this to Carol Chen's law office. She handled Dad's estate, knows how to read between the lines. Frank gathered his papers, pausing at the door. Watch your back, Scott. Money trails make people nervous. Locked up just as dusk was settling in. Binder tucked securely under my arm. The streetlights were flickering to life one by one down Main Street, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal. That's when I noticed the car. Dark sedan, parked across the street, headlights off. As I turned toward my truck, the engine hummed to life. The headlights blazed, held steady for 3 long seconds. Then the car pulled away slowly, deliberately. I stood there watching the taillights disappear around the corner, trying to ignore the cold feeling spreading through my gut. Who had just witnessed our paper trail taking shape? The morning after spotting that mysterious car, I dove into my phone's backup files like a man possessed. You know that sick feeling when you realize someone's been laughing at you behind your back? Try finding proof of it in black and white. I'd been part of this group chat with Melissa and some mutual friends, mostly planning stuff for the wedding. Scrolling back through the exported texts felt like watching a horror movie where you already know the ending. 3 weeks before the wedding, there it was. Melissa. You should see him fussing over the centerpieces. Karen. Still playing along? Melissa. Like a puppy who thinks he's getting a treat. My hands shook as I captured screenshots, making sure each one showed the date stamps and phone numbers. Dad's voice echoed in my head. Digital evidence is like wet cement. Catch it before it sets. I went through methodically, exporting everything to PDFs, triple-checking that the metadata stayed intact. Times, dates, participant numbers, all of it preserved like insects in amber. Each file got backed up to 3 different clouds. You can't be too careful when you're dealing with people who know how to cover their tracks. The group chat had about 15 regular participants. I started making calls, working down the list. But wouldn't you know it? Phones were suddenly lost. Numbers had changed. And those messages I just archived? Deleted from everyone else's phones like they never existed. Sorry, Scott, one guy mumbled before hanging up. Don't want to get involved. Around 10, I walked into Carol Chen's law office, that binder tucked under my arm like a shield. The receptionist's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when I gave my name. Carol had handled my father's estate with razor-sharp efficiency. I laid out my evidence the way she taught me. Chronological order, cross-referenced, everything labeled. The bank transfers went first, then the text screenshots, followed by a timeline of the wedding sabotage. See here, I said, pointing to the matching amounts. $5,000 out of my account on March 15th, $5,000 into her brother's business, March 16th. 3 more transfers follow the exact same pattern. Carol flipped through the pages with that neutral lawyer's face they must teach in law school. When she got to the texts, she barely raised an eyebrow. The timing seems suspicious, she admitted, closing the binder. But it's thin, Scott. Very thin. Thin? My voice cracked like I was 15 again. There's a clear pattern of... Pattern isn't proof. She slid the binder back across her desk. These transfers could be explained as business investments. The texts are catty but not criminal. Without direct evidence of intent to defraud, behind me, her printer whirred to life, spitting out someone else's victory paperwork. The sound felt like sandpaper on my pride. I appreciate you thinking of me, she said, standing. But I don't see a winnable case. Here. I walked out into a fine drizzle that beaded up on the binder's cover. The sticky note where I'd written, financial evidence, was starting to bleed, the ink running like tears. Back at the store, I spent an hour reorganizing everything. New tabs, better labels, clearer chronology. If one lawyer wouldn't take it, I'd find another. And this time, I'd document every step. Who saw what, when they saw it, what they said. Chain of custody, like they talk about on those crime shows. I shot Frank a text. Chen passed. Says it's too thin. Meeting tomorrow at dawn? His reply came quick. First light. Bring coffee. Strong. Pulling up my contacts, I found another attorney's number. Guy who'd helped with some contract work last year. Maybe he'd see what Carol missed. I hit dial. Listened to it ring once. Then, click. Dead air. I pulled the phone from my ear and stared at the screen. No signal. Not one bar. You know what's weird about silence? Sometimes it's louder than any warning could be. The email hit my inbox at 6:42 a.m., right as I was unlocking the front door. Subject line: important. Account status change. My coffee went cold in my hand while I read it twice. Due to disputed activity, temporary freeze, protecting all parties. You ever notice how banks use such polite words when they're about to kick your legs out from under you? I set my mug down before I could drop it, pulled up my account dashboard, and there it was. Credit line frozen, just like that. No warning, no phone call, nothing but automated courtesy. Well, ain't that something? I muttered to the empty store. The morning sun slanted through the windows, making dust motes dance like nothing had changed. But everything had. I grabbed the whiteboard from behind the counter, the one where I usually tracked special orders and delivery dates. With hands steadier than I felt, I started writing numbers. For $200 due to Anderson Supply next week. For $850 for utilities by the 15th. $3,600 in payroll for my 2 part-timers coming up fast. The list kept growing, each figure another weight on my chest. The total made my throat tight. $14,650 due within the month. Without that credit line, I might as well have been trying to bail out the ocean with a coffee cup. I picked up the phone and dialed the bank's customer service. You know that maze of automated options they put you through? I must have pressed enough numbers to write a novel before getting a human voice. This is Jessica. How may I assist you today? Scott Weston, account number 847-223. I need to discuss the freeze on my business credit line. I understand your concern, Mr. Weston. Let me check that for you. The typing sounds felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. I see the hold was placed due to disputed transactions requiring review. This is a standard procedure that, how long will the review take? Unfortunately, I cannot provide a specific time frame. These matters typically resolve within. I cut her off politely but firmly. Could you note in the file that I called today at, I checked my watch, 8:17 a.m., spoke with Jessica Thompson, and formally disputed the hold? Yes, sir, I can do that. After hanging up, I wrote every detail in my father's old ledger. Date, time, representative's name, reference number. Dad always said documentation was like building a ladder. You need every rung to reach the top. The store lease was in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, crisp despite being nearly 20 years old. Dad had signed it originally. Then I'd renewed it 5 years back. Flipping through, I found what I was dreading on page 4, paragraph 3. Failure to maintain operation for 30 consecutive days shall constitute grounds for immediate termination. My hands weren't quite as steady now as I circled those words in red. Above them I wrote today's date, September 8th. The math wasn't complicated. October 8th would be the point of no return. I texted Frank. Bank froze the line. 30 days before lease terminates. Need to talk. His reply came back quick. On my way. Bring out the good coffee. While waiting, I drafted emails to my main vendors. Kept it professional. Outlined a partial payment plan. Promised updates within 48 hours. The responses started rolling in immediately. All automated. Out of office. Your message has been received. Please allow 2-3 business days. Frank showed up as I was locking up. Well past midnight. He took one look at the whiteboard, at that red circle around 30 days, and nodded slowly. How many? He asked. 29 days, 14 hours, I said, checking my watch. Give or take a few minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, making that red circle look like it was pulsing. Tomorrow, I'd have to decide, fight or fold. But right then, all I could do was stare at those numbers and listen to the clock tick. The next morning felt like walking underwater. I sat at the counter with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to the same hold music I'd been hearing for, I checked my watch, 2 hours and 17 minutes. You know that tinny melody they play? I swear I could hum it in my sleep now. Thank you for your patience. A new voice finally said. This is Margaret. Senior Account Supervisor. I straightened up, pen ready. Margaret, I'm Scott Weston. Account 847223. I've been trying to resolve a credit freeze situation. Yes, I see the notes from yesterday's call with Jessica. Unfortunately, before we continue, I cut in, keeping my tone professional. I'd like to confirm I'm speaking with Margaret. I let the silence hang. Thompson. Margaret Thompson. I wrote it down, adding the time and date. Thank you, Margaret. Now, regarding the freeze, for the next 40 minutes, I documented every careful, unfortunately, and at this time, she offered. Each promise to expedite the review went into my father's ledger, along with reference numbers that felt about as useful as fishing line in a hurricane. When that dead end was thoroughly documented, I called Bob Marshall, my landlord of 20 years. His secretary put me through faster than I expected. Scott, he said, and I could hear the awkward pause. What can I do for you? I laid it out, clean and simple. The credit freeze, the temporary cash flow issue, my perfect payment history. Asked if we could work something out, maybe adjust the timeline. The silence on his end was so polite, it hurt. I understand the situation, he finally said, but the terms are quite clear in the lease. More silence, more politeness. No help. After hanging up, I pulled up the local paper's website and started drafting a classified ad. Hardware, liquidation, complete inventory, fixtures, tools. All must go. Contact. My finger hovered over publish while my throat tried to close up. That's when I needed to move, to touch something real. I walked to aisle 3, where we kept the levels and measuring tools. There was this old Stanley level my father swore by. Still accurate after 30 years. I picked it up, felt its weight, remembered him teaching me how to read the bubbles. A true level doesn't lie, he'd say, and neither do we. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. I'd been avoiding his check-ins all morning. I typed back, maybe this is bigger than me. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, not wanting to see his reply. The half-printed liquidation ad sat there like an accusation. Before I could think too hard, I fed it into the shredder, watching it turn into confetti. Then, feeling like an idiot, I found myself picking up the pieces, trying to smooth them out on the counter. My hands weren't quite steady, and that made me even more embarrassed. Remember how I mentioned that whiteboard with the countdown? I'd drawn little boxes for each remaining day. 28 of them now, lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. At closing time, I erased one with my sleeve, leaving a gray smudge that wouldn't quite wipe clean. The bell over the door hadn't rung all day, not once. I stood there in the dimming light, finger on the switch, and asked myself if tomorrow would be the day I finally admitted defeat, if tomorrow would be when I stopped being my father's son and became just another failed business owner with the story nobody wanted to hear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, waiting for my decision. The next morning I was already at the counter when Frank's knock came at 5:30 a.m. That early, the store had this particular smell. Coffee starting to brew, yesterday's sawdust settled, and that hint of cedar that never quite faded. You know how certain moments get burned into your memory? This was going to be one of them. Frank didn't say hello. He just set a small digital recorder on the counter between us, right next to my father's ledger. His expression was different than I'd ever seen it, tight around the eyes, like a man carrying something heavy. "Scott," he said, "there's something Melissa didn't know I had." My coffee went cold in my hand. "What do you mean?" 2 weeks before the wedding, I ran into her at Carlton's diner. She was with her brother. Didn't notice me in the next booth. I'm an old newsman. Habit made me hit record when I heard your name. He pressed play, and suddenly Melissa's voice filled the empty store. That laugh of hers. Bright, almost musical. The sound used to make me smile. Now it made my knuckles go white on the counter edge. "You should have seen his face when I said yes," she was saying. Like a puppy getting a treat. God, it was almost too easy. Her brother's voice, muffled but clear enough. "You really think you can get him to spend it all? Please." Another laugh. "He's already dumped his savings into the wedding. Told him it had to be perfect. You know, to show everyone how special we are." The way she drew out that word, special, made my stomach turn. The bet was to strip him bare, right? Well, mission almost accomplished. And the guest list? Her brother again. Already handled. Been spreading little hints for weeks. Nothing direct. Just enough to make people question. By the time he figures it out, no one will want to be seen with him. The mighty Scott Weston, standing all alone at his own wedding. I had to sit down. The words kept rolling out. Every detail. Every calculated move. The way she'd timed the credit freeze with her brother's help. How they'd planned to let me struggle just long enough before swooping in to save the store at a fraction of its worth. Frank stopped the recording. Neither of us spoke for a full minute. Chain of custody, I finally managed. My voice sounded far away. We need to document everything about this recording. Frank nodded, already pulling out his reporter's notebook. Date, time, location of the original recording. I've got witness statements from the diner staff who remember them being there. Plus, he tapped the recorder. This model timestamps every file. Can't be altered without leaving digital fingerprints. We spent the next hour writing it all down. Every detail about how he'd made the recording, where it had been stored, who had access. The kind of methodical work that would stand up to scrutiny. Then we drafted a single page for the media. Just the facts. Dates, quotes, and evidence. No emotional language, no accusations. Let Melissa's own words do the work. Where do you want to do this? Frank asked when we finished. I didn't even have to think. The courthouse steps. He raised an eyebrow. That's where they're planning to file the divorce papers next week. Melissa's brother was bragging about it at the bank. How they'd make sure to have photographers there. I allowed myself a small smile. Seems like the perfect spot to me. Frank checked his calendar. We've got 27 days before they can force the store closure. When do you want to move? I counted forward, considering angles and timing. Circled next Tuesday in red. Here. Gives us time to get the press involved, but not so long they can catch wind and countermove. We spent the rest of the morning drafting press invitations. Nothing dramatic. Just a hint that new evidence would reveal financial fraud and manipulation involving prominent local families. The kind of bait no reporter can resist. By closing time, every envelope was addressed and ready. I stood at the window, watching the sun set behind the courthouse across the square. For the first time since the wedding, I felt ready to step into daylight. You know what this means, Frank said, gathering his things to leave. I nodded, feeling the weight of the recorder in my pocket. Time to show them what never enough really looks like. The morning after we set the date, I started making calls. You ever notice how different your voice sounds when you finally have the upper hand? Mine felt steady, certain, like my dad's used to when he was closing a deal. Yes, ma'am. Documentation will be provided, I told the Channel 4 assignment editor. Financial records, text messages, and audio evidence. That last part always got their attention. 3 more stations confirmed within the hour. Frank brought coffee while I worked at the counter, sorting papers into manila envelopes. Each one labeled with precision: financial timeline, communication evidence, witness statements. The kind of organization that tells people you mean business. Remember, Frank said, watching me seal the last envelope. Start with the human angle. Make them feel it before you show them proof. I nodded, uncapping a pen. The opening statement had to be perfect. Clear enough for sound bites, but raw enough to grab hearts. I wrote, crossed out, wrote again. 2 minutes, we'd decided. Long enough to hook them, short enough to keep everyone's attention. Got the portable speaker from my church days, Frank said, setting up a test. Batteries fresh, volume's good. We'll do a mic check at 8 tomorrow, before anyone shows. The courthouse clerk's email came just before lunch. Divorce filing scheduled for 2 p.m. the next day, right when Melissa's brother had planned their little victory party. I could almost hear their champagne glasses clinking. Perfect timing, Frank said when I showed him. We'll set up at 1:30. Give the cameras time to get in position. We arranged everything twice, making sure we knew exactly where each piece would go. Table for the evidence, podium for the statement. Speaker positioned for maximum clarity. The kind of details that separate amateurs from pros. Remember those nights when you're waiting for something big? How the clock seems to mock you? That's how it felt in my apartment above the store. Traffic sounds filtered up through the old windows. A car door. Voices, each one making me wonder if word had gotten out. I kept touching the recorder in my jacket pocket, making sure it was still there. Checked the backup copy on my phone. Double-checked the battery in the speaker. You know what they say about measure twice? Cut once. This was measure about 50 times. The suit was hanging ready. The same one I'd worn to the church. Some might call it twisted, wearing it again. But there's something about taking back what was stolen from you. Piece by piece, I polished those shoes until I could see my reflection. Dad always said you could tell a man's character by his shoes. The alarm went off at 5 a.m., but I was already awake. Shower, shave, each button of that suit shirt like loading ammunition. The tie, the one Dad left me, knotted perfectly on the first try. Frank met me at the store at 6. We loaded everything into his car and did one final inventory. Evidence binder, envelopes, speaker, extension cord just in case, bottle of water. His old reporter's instincts showing. Always have backups for your backups. Ready? He asked as we pulled up to the courthouse. The steps were empty except for a maintenance guy sweeping. The morning air had that crisp feel that makes everything seem sharper, clearer. We started setting up while the sun was still throwing long shadows. By 1:15, the cameras were rolling in. First one van, then another. Reporters testing their mics, photographers choosing angles. The kind of controlled chaos that means something's about to happen. I felt it then, that old shame trying to crawl back in. The memory of standing alone at the church. The whispers. The crossed streets. My hands started to sweat, but then I saw them coming. Melissa's family. Her brother leading the way with that smile that always looked more like a smirk. Their lawyer trailing behind with a briefcase full of papers meant to bury me. They spotted the cameras and faltered for just a second. Confusion flickered across her brother's face. But then the smile came back, bigger than ever. Like this was just another thing they could brush aside. I lifted the binder and felt its weight. Solid. Real. Every page inside was another nail in their coffin, and they didn't even know it yet. Frank touched my shoulder. 2 minutes, he said quietly. I stepped up to the microphones, feeling their weight like judges' eyes. The media crowd had grown. Maybe 20 people now. A mix of local outlets and a couple regional stations. Perfect. More coverage meant less chance of this getting buried. My name is Scott Weston, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I own Weston Hardware on Main Street, same as my father did. I'm here today because it's time to replace rumors with receipts. A few pens started moving. Good. I opened the binder to the first tab, pulled out the timeline we'd prepared. 3 months ago, I stood alone at my own wedding. No guests showed up. The woman I was supposed to marry disappeared. I paused, letting that sink in. What I didn't know then was why. Today, I'm going to show you. I reached for the envelope marked Financial Trail and laid out the bank statements. They were color-coded, easy to follow. Just like Dad taught me, make it simple for people to understand. These documents show a pattern, I continued, holding up the first page. Every major withdrawal from my accounts matches, within 24 hours, deposits into businesses owned by Thomas Carlton, my former fiancé's brother. The reporters leaned forward. Someone whispered, Jesus. I saw Thomas shift his weight, that smirk finally cracking. But money only tells part of the story, I said, reaching for the recorder. This was recorded 2 weeks ago at the Crown Bar and Grill. The voice you'll hear is Melissa Carlton. Frank gave me a slight nod. I pressed play. Melissa's laugh came through first. That bright, cutting sound I used to love. Then her words. Such an easy mark. Tom bet me I couldn't get him to spend everything on a wedding no one would attend. Should have seen his face when he read that note. You were never enough. Classic, right? More laughter. Then, best part? He documented everything himself. All those careful little receipts. Probably still has them in that sad little store. I stopped the recording. The courthouse steps had gone dead quiet. Cameras whirred, adjusting focus between me and the Carlton family. Thomas's face had gone slack. Their lawyer was frantically scribbling notes. Questions? I asked. A reporter from Channel 4 raised her hand. Mr. Weston, did you pursue legal action before this? Yes. Multiple attorneys declined to take the case, citing insufficient evidence. That changed when this recording surfaced. Another hand. Can you verify the voice on the recording? I gestured to the table beside me. I've prepared exhibits for each of you. Package A contains the authenticated audio file, chain of custody documentation, and witness statements confirming Ms. Carlton's presence at the location and time of recording. I moved to the table, spreading out the labeled manila envelopes. Package B contains the financial records I referenced. Package C holds screenshots of text messages where Ms. Carlton mocked me to friends weeks before the wedding. Each exhibit includes proper documentation of sources and timestamps. The reporters started forward, but I held up a hand. One moment. For those wanting high-resolution copies, I've included contact cards with secure download instructions. Every claim I've made is backed by verifiable evidence. Movement caught my eye. Melissa's phone lit up. Probably her lawyer, finally catching wind of this. She declined the call, her eyes narrowing to slits. That look used to intimidate me. Not anymore. I let the silence build for 3 heartbeats, then turned toward the courthouse doors. Behind those doors, the Carlton family planned to file papers today. Papers designed to finish what they started at that empty church. I faced the cameras again. So here's my question to this town. Do you want to believe their printed lies? Or would you rather hear the truth in their own recorded words? The media surge toward the evidence table answered that question pretty clearly. The reporters swarmed the evidence table like hungry fish finding fresh bait. I stayed at the microphone, keeping my face neutral while they worked. Years of helping customers find exactly what they needed had taught me when to step back and let people dig for themselves. "Mr. Weston," a young reporter from the Chronicle called out, "these bank records, can we verify these numbers independently? Every account number and routing code is included in your packets," I said. "Feel free to contact the banks directly." She was already dialing, notepad balanced on her knee. Around her, other reporters were doing the same, calling editors, photographing documents, cross-referencing dates. The kind of methodical verification my father would have appreciated. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Locals who'd probably come for routine courthouse business but stopped to watch the show. I caught fragments of their conversations. "Can't believe they'd do that to Scott," and "always seemed like such a nice girl." The whispers had a different edge now, sharp with betrayal, but not aimed at me anymore. I kept my comments minimal, pointing to specific pages when asked. "The evidence speaks for itself," I said more than once. Every few minutes, someone would request another play of the recording. Each time Melissa's laughter cut through the air, I watched more faces harden. Thomas stepped away from his sister, phone pressed to his ear. Whatever he was hearing drained the color from his face. His thumb moved frantically across the screen, scrolling through what I guessed were messages or maybe stock alerts. He turned his back to the crowd, but I caught him tugging at his collar. "Mr. Weston," another reporter raised her hand. "About the credit freeze, can you elaborate on the timing?" "The bank restricted my business line of credit shortly after I began questioning these transactions," I said, tapping the relevant exhibit. "The disputed charges align perfectly with deposits into Carlton Construction's accounts. Those dates are highlighted in yellow in your packets." A photographer crouched to get a better angle of Thomas's reaction. Smart kid. That shot would tell the story better than any quote. "I'll remain here for any additional press arriving," I announced, starting to pack the binder with deliberate slowness. "Feel free to examine the exhibits thoroughly. There are enough copies for everyone." I left the microphones live, their black heads still hungry for sound. Better to let them catch whatever might come next. The Carltons huddled by the courthouse doors, their lawyer gesturing urgently. Melissa kept checking her phone, each glance more frantic than the last. The confidence they'd walked in with had curdled into something else entirely. A business reporter I recognized from Channel 7 was running numbers on his phone calculator. "These transfers," he called out, "they total nearly—" "All the figures are accurate," I cut in smoothly. "Down to the last penny." More phones buzzed in the crowd. Someone gasped. I glanced over to see people pointing at their screens, sharing whatever news had just broken. Thomas's face went a shade paler. He yanked at his tie, nearly running to show something on his phone to their lawyer. The attorney's expression told me all I needed to know. The first domino had fallen. I stayed at my post, hands relaxed at my sides, watching the ripples spread. Dad always said the best revenge was letting people crash on their own mistakes. Just had to be patient enough to wait for gravity to do its work. The crowd had grown now, courthouse employees drifting out to watch. I recognized faces that had turned away from me in the hardware store aisles. They weren't turning away anymore. "If anyone needs copies of these materials," I said into the still live microphones, "I'll be at my store during regular business hours. As always, we're open early." I caught a few small smiles at that. They remembered who I was, who I'd always been. The Carltons' huddle grew more intense, urgent whispers carrying just far enough to sound desperate. Whatever was happening behind those phones and notifications was hitting them hard. Good. Let them feel what it was like, watching everything collapse in public. I stood my ground as the wave built, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. The truth was doing its work. All I had to do was wait. I must have dozed off in my office chair because my phone's buzzing jolted me awake around 7 that evening. The screen was lit up like a Christmas tree. Missed calls, texts, news alerts, all competing for attention. My neck cracked as I straightened up, but what I read drove away any stiffness. The first headline hit like a sledgehammer. "Carlton Construction investors pull out amid integrity concerns." I clicked through. Coffee forgotten in my hand. 3 major backers had withdrawn their commitments within hours of my press conference. The article quoted one saying they couldn't partner with leadership that showed such calculated malice. Thomas's financing round, the one he'd been bragging about for months, had imploded spectacularly. You know that feeling when justice arrives all at once? Like a dam breaking after years of pressure? That's what it felt like scrolling through my notifications. The local news sites weren't any kinder to Melissa. Wedding bet scheme exposed. Local woman orchestrated public humiliation. There was her face. That familiar smile now stripped of its shine, next to quotes from my recording. The community Facebook groups that had whispered about me were now flooded with people sharing their disgust. How could anyone be so cruel? They asked. The same voices that had avoided me were suddenly loud with support. My email pinged. A formal notice from Carlton Construction's legal team announcing the suspension of operations pending internal review. I remembered Thomas's face on those courthouse steps when his phone started buzzing. Now I knew what he'd been reading. Well, would you look at that? I muttered, setting down my cold coffee. The 30-day clock was still ticking on my whiteboard, but somehow its red circle didn't seem so threatening anymore. I stood up, stretching muscles tight from tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Outside, the evening air held that perfect late summer crispness, the kind that makes you want to start fresh. I looked up at the store's sign, my father's sign, weathered by years of sun and storms. Its letters had faded to ghosts of themselves. The paint and brushes were right where they'd always been. Aisle 4, second shelf. I grabbed a drop cloth from the contractor supplies and dragged the tall ladder from the back. The street lamp buzzed to life as I set up, casting a pool of yellow light that would have to do. You ever notice how some tasks just feel right in your bones? That's how it felt, working my way across each letter. W-E-S-T-O-N-S. The brushstrokes were meditation, each one covering old scars with fresh purpose. H-A-R-D-W-A-R-E. Paint fumes mixed with the store's cedar smell, my father's signature scent, until I could almost feel him watching. Frank had texted earlier, "You did good, kid. Your old man would be proud." I believed him. Dad's way was always about keeping receipts, maintaining records, letting truth speak for itself. Funny how his habits ended up saving more than just inventory. The final E took extra care. I stepped back, wiped my hands, and pulled out my phone. The sign gleamed in the streetlight, proud as a new morning. I snapped a photo, proof for my own records, you might say. 23 days left on that deadline clock, but standing there, I knew we'd make it. I packed up slowly, each movement a ritual of reclaiming what was mine. The drop cloth folded with satisfying precision, brushes cleaned and stored, ladder locked away. Everything in its place, just like Dad taught me. At the door, I paused. The air still carried that mix of fresh paint and aged wood, new life breathing into old bones. I thought about Dad's ledger, about Frank's steady hand with that recorder, about all the quiet ways truth finds its voice. Looking up at those fresh letters, strong against the night sky, I said what needed saying. A man's silence can be louder than their lies. I locked up and headed home, leaving the sign to dry in the honest dark.